Hello and welcome to our first Adult ADHD chat here on the internet. I'm your host, Lindsay Buroker, and my co-host here, the woman with all the knowledge, is Amy Voros from Creative Catapult Coaching. And today we're going to be discussing some of the traits of adult ADHD and some coping strategies to help you find success with whatever you're doing. Amy, this is our first official show here. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into coaching people with ADHD?
Sure. So I'm a certified life coach and an ADHD coach with specialized training beyond just life coach training. I've actually reached the ICF PCC level of certification, which means that I've got a lot of training. And I've also been coaching for over 750 client hours at this point, which it means I spend a lot of time dealing with a lot of people over the last 10 years. The reason I ended up getting into ADHD coaching was recently I discovered life coaching a decade ago after I was diagnosed with ADHD myself, and to realize that there were actually people who served in a more formal role to what I had been attempting to get, really bosses, and tried to set up a lot of structures like this for myself. But there was actually a formal way to do it, and that was kind of coaching and helping people problem solve and set up their own accountability and their own ways to problem solve that didn't depend on a family member, a boyfriend or girlfriend, husband, wife, or parents or other friends that can really, over time, the dynamics can be not so great for your personal relationships. So I decided that I really wanted to work with people who were like myself, and I understand where I'm coming from. There's a lot of stuff about ADHD that I can empathize with, and I can also hold the space for somebody to know that there is a different way. And there's just a lot of people who don't even know that this is another way that you can help manage your life. A lot of what an ADHD coach will do is actually offer a little bit more structured support than a typical life coach. But then we also have an understanding of sort of the patterns that show up with ADHD and some of the neurological underpinnings that actually change why doing it the way you might have been taught in school or from your family might not work for you.
For those who are listening who may actually be wondering, do we actually say what ADHD is? What is it? They probably know, but
It's attention deficit disorder, which is in the DSM-5, which is sort of the psychiatric diagnostic manual that's used, and it's been called ADD in the past, attention deficit disorder. Before that, it's had some other lovely names, including minimal brain dysfunction and just being a bad person. I think you're on mute.
Sorry,
Lindsay.
I just managed to self-mute myself. This is our first show. We mentioned we are super experienced and professional here. For those, adults out there that may be listening and are wondering, like, do I have ADHD? Is it pretty common for people to have missed getting diagnosed as children?
Definitely. Because a lot of people think ADD disappears when you hit adulthood. Well, it's not like you turn 18 and suddenly you get the right to vote and your ADD goes away. So if you didn't fit sort of a very narrow profile of being sort of super hyperactive and bouncing off the walls, it's really common that adults are getting diagnosed now in their 20s, 30s, 40s, even 60s, 70s, and 80s. I've heard about people getting diagnosed and dealing with and being able to make some changes because there's finally a reason for the way they and an understanding of where they are. Really only about 10% of adults, maybe it was 5%. Anyway, not a lot of adults with ADD are being treated formally, or they may be doing more informal, meditation or self-medication with caffeine or any number of other substances, or just wondering what in the world is wrong with them and assuming that, there's something wrong because, they're trying harder and they still can't make it work. And a lot of the criteria used to be that, if it didn't show up, if you weren't recognized before the age of 7 in a pretty narrow spectrum of symptoms, that you couldn't have ADD. They've sort of refined some of those diagnostic characteristics now. But another reason a lot of adults, and especially women, are often missed for diagnosis is that we're able to internalize a lot of it, although it takes a pretty major hit to your self-esteem when you just sort of absorb the 20,000 plus negative comments that you might have gotten by the time you're 12 and just continues on for your adult life.
I imagine to some people kind of learn to mask the symptoms too and just get by, and maybe people don't realize how much they're struggling inside.
Definitely. And that was me, was just always like, well, if I try harder, let me tell you how miserable being an executive assistant was for somebody who's considered herself smart and yet had to retract 4 out of every 5 meeting requests I sent out in support of my director, despite proofing them repeatedly. I'm just feeling stupid because I knew that I needed to proof it, and yet I'd made this same mistake again. I'm just feeling careless. And that comes at a pretty high mental cost.
For those who are wondering if maybe sounds like them a little bit, what are some of the kind of, I know people look up like symptoms. I don't know if that's the right word. Like I have the disease of ADHD, but maybe what are some typical traits of ADHD in adults?
And like anything, this is kind of a broad spectrum. Humans exist sort of, all along this, bell curve really. And so ADHD people, or people with traits of ADHD like symptoms, may or may not officially meet diagnostic criteria. Excuse me. But a lot of times having a hard time getting to meetings on time, keeping things neat and organized, and ability to start and finish tasks, especially on time. On the flip side of that, though, can also be hyper-focused. So focusing on something you love or are really good at to the detriment of anything and everything else in your life. Even eating sometime. I've known people who can go 14 hours working on something that they're passionate about and then just forget to take care of themselves as well. You've made fun of my kitchen and my bedroom for years, having stuff everywhere. Despite working on that, that's one of my own personal areas I'm kind of sensitive about. At least living alone, I only have to make it good enough for me. But, that perception of being disorganized, even if I know where everything is, you walk into my space and to anyone else, it looks like not necessarily dirty, but very disorganized. And yet I can tell you where everything is. So different organizing styles too. Anyway, I'm sure I can keep going, but a lot of short-term memory issues and just different ways of doing things, and a hard time being successful doing things in sort of the way that's expected.
Well, I apologize if it came across that I was making fun of you, because I've known you, so we should say I've known you since 5th grade.
That's true.
And
we've been friends.
Kids too is not they're not the most sensitive or really.
Well, we haven't quite developed as much tact or as much, our language and nuance hopefully continues to develop as we become adults.
Yeah. All right. Well, if anybody has a messy room out there, it's okay. We are allowing it officially on this channel.
Well, yeah, it becomes, when it becomes a problem though, and it can be a problem. I'm not saying it, if you've got mold infestations of bugs, you're probably to point that something needs to change. I'm not going to tell you where that line is, but there is a point where if it's a legitimate health hazard, finding a way to make it through that might be okay.
And we're going to talk about that a little bit farther down too, kind of some coping strategies to maybe help with that kind of thing. But before we go into that, for people who are maybe just newly figuring out that this might be them, when does it make sense as an adult to seek out a diagnosis and possibly ask, would medication be helpful for me?
So that's a really personal question, but a lot of times just knowing why you're acting the way you are can be a big relief. Labels aren't everything. I still have a mixed opinion of the ADHD label applied to myself, but it does give some other context for a lot of reasons the way I am that I am. So for me, what sort of was the reason I pursued a diagnosis was an inability to focus and function and stay on task at work, because the work was meaningful, but it wasn't really urgent or interesting in my experience, until it became fire breaking loose. And logically I could see that, this wasn't how I wanted to do it, but I couldn't change it. I went back to my desk 7 or 8 times most days, as I'm leaving the office, just to make sure I'd forgotten nothing. And so it just kind of a building awareness that my coworkers, commented on it. And then I think I said something to somebody else and I was like, you don't do that? And again, with the executive assistant work, realizing that, this was just taking way too much of a mental effort. So really, if things are too hard, and sometimes it's like if things just feel off and not like you aren't living up to your capabilities, it can be worth just from a mental health perspective to, look, is it ADD? Is it depression? Is it something else? And then medication is also a really personal choice. Most ADD gets best treated from, a multitude of perspectives: environment modification, work modification, understanding yourself. Medication is effective for, probably about 70% of the people who take it, but there's, 30% it's not effective. And it can also take a really long time to find the right medication at the right dosage. And, so getting support from a multitude of different directions, and as humans, remembering that we don't do really great in isolation in any sense, is important, but shifting to being able to work with somebody and not see it as, a failure of your personality is, can be really hard.
I imagine, I'm sure that some jobs too are like you were saying, the executive assistant thing. Like I know I've kind of been self-employed for almost 20 years and that works really well for me. I had a hard time being motivated too and like really wanting to go above and beyond with somebody else's stuff. Like if you're passionate about something, it really helps. You may end up working too much then. You were talking about the hyper-focused aspect, but yeah, I'm sure any job where there's like a lot of, working in an environment with a lot of noise and stuff, I just imagine it'd be horrible.
Yeah, noise, a lot of background noise didn't work. At least the executive assistant job, things were pretty quiet. It was a pretty calm and supportive environment. And I really wanted to do well. I believed in the nonprofit I worked for and, what we were doing, and it was great. And yet I just couldn't do the work to my standards. And it was really disheartening at best.
So it sounds like a common struggle is focusing or staying on task. And you're gonna have to do some degree of that, I think, in any job, even if you find something that's better suited to you. So do you have any tips for people that, want to get better at that?
Well, a lot of it is, understanding your environment and kind of what keeps you from focusing. Some broad things I try and pay attention to are my energy levels. Is there background noise? I took to wearing earplugs at my day job I currently work for our parks department as well as coaching, which is actually a much better fit for me. But there are times where, you know, I work in a recreation center, so there's a lot of people, there's a lot going on, and I have a really hard time blocking out background noise. And so earplugs can be, you know, just a layer to help me sort of shut out that sound, which makes, for me, focus much more easy. There's part of the challenge with ADHD is our brains don't filter out external stimuli. And so everything comes in at the same level of importance, even if we don't want it to. So if I'm somewhere, I'm likely listening to a conversation halfway across the room, whether I want to or not, which is great when you need to monitor what's going on in your building, but, you know, maybe not so great when you need to be working on a spreadsheet.
I know I'm a writer. I don't think I mentioned in the intro, and I know other writers that they have to leave their house and go to like the coffee shop to work because they need some kind of stimulation. And I'm just like horrified by that. Like I can do it. I think like you, I have to put in music or something and have my earbuds, or it's just really hard to get anything done. You hear like the hiss of the steamer, you know, people's conversations everywhere. And so it's good to be aware of that. So do you ever do like white noise or anything like that? Can that be helpful for that?
It depends on kind of the type of task I'm doing, or I've got a deep focus playlist on Amazon that's sort of background ambient music. And sometimes that can be really helpful. Other times I do like noise. And there are times too where I actually benefit from changing location. There's a lot of, sometimes I just need to try a whole bunch of different things to figure out what's going to work today.
As someone who wanders around and does all my work on a laptop, I totally understand. Like some days it's the couch, some days it is the bedroom. That's one of the nice perks about working from home. Not so helpful for people stuck in an office at a job, but one thing you had mentioned before we started recording that I hadn't heard about was this concept of a body double and how that can be useful for people with ADHD. Could you explain what that is and how that works?
Yeah, and my guess is indirectly this might be what some of your writer friends are relying on when they're going to a coffee shop, but you can often pick up on the energy of another person or the environment that you're in and use that to leverage your own focus and ability to achieve something. So there's, you know, I haven't necessarily seen any definitive reason, you know, from like studies that can identify why it works, but, you know, a lot of people have used it unconsciously, often to their embarrassment when, you know, your friend comes over and suddenly you're going to be folding all the laundry or going through the mail, you know, but that body and that presence somehow can leave you more physically present in the moment and help sort of calm the focus and energy, especially for doing mundane tasks. It can be a real lifesaver. That's often, I've worked with kids who will choose to do their homework with their parents in the next room. Sometimes you just need somebody else there. They don't need to interact with you, but just being a presence can often change your ability to focus and pursue staying grounded and mentally present and less likely to wander off mentally.
I wonder if there's any sort of like, I'm not sure guilt is the right word, but like you feel like somebody's there, so you have to
I
be
think
on task and perform.
I think that might be part of it. You know, it's, you know, to a certain degree, meeting social expectations, maybe. I saw somebody's theory that, you know, you're basically felt a responsibility to the other person that you'd convinced to, you know, work as a body double for you, you know, whether that was just a friend that you're sitting there, but, you know. So I'm not sure that I've ever felt guilt, but,
Maybe,
you know, it's
yeah.
an interesting, you know, I think there may be a whole bunch of reasons. I also saw a theory floated about mirror neurons, where humans, you know, you watch somebody else and your brain tries to mimic it. So another theory, I saw somebody else floating a theory about somehow it was a chi balancer. Again, not something that I'd really thought about, but I've seen it work, I've used it, and I know clients, lots of clients that have found it really useful.
Yeah, I think the article I read after you mentioned it was sort of like somebody who was kind of like frenetic energy type person had trouble focusing, and just having his wife in the room who was really chill and like working on needlepoint or something, somehow that really helped him focus.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in matching the energy of the person that you're working around.
So I've also seen studies, kind of moving on to another topic, that you know, some people say like, oh, I'm awesome at multitasking. I can do all these things at once. But the studies usually suggest that no, actually, you didn't do any of those things well when you were trying to multitask. But is that anything, is it more true with ADHD, or is it better to like have a bunch of things and work on them throughout the day?
You know, that's a really good question. And for me, the answer varies day over day. You know, it's like as far as a lot of deep focus, multitasking, you're probably not going to do real well. And at the other extreme, you know, there's, you know, classic memes on the internet of like, oh, you know, you start the laundry, but on the way downstairs, you find a book, you know, to put away. So you set down the laundry basket to go put down the book, and pretty soon you're eating Ben and Jerry's out of the freezer 4 hours later, and the laundry's still on the steps. So what the multitasking doesn't work, but like this morning, I was alternating, spending a couple minutes putting away laundry with washing dishes, neither of which are my favorite tasks, but for me this morning, having just the two of those that I was focusing on and kind of bouncing between them was working really well. And there's some days I've tried that and it's a disaster. So I'm not sure it's any better, but you know, the novelty of task switching sometimes can be a good thing, because for an ADHD brain, newness and novelty kind of gets your dopamine going. And so the multitasking kind of gives you that dopamine hit, but it also has to be used, I think, with some caution.
I suppose there are some tasks too that lend themselves more to that. Like I know I've talked about, I'll have administrative kind of days where I'm like answering email. I may be uploading chapters for an audiobook and I got to wait for those to upload. Over here, I'm like preparing an ad campaign for my books. And those kind of days I end up jumping around a ton. But when I'm writing, like I love it when that's the only thing I have to do. And sometimes I turn off the internet because I just want to fully get into that world I'm creating. And I can't, yeah, like when I try to multitask doing that, it's just no good for me at all.
Yeah,
I
no,
cannot
and
do
that
it.
makes a lot of sense. So a lot of times, instead of thinking about it maybe as task multitasking, you know, kind of what you were doing is time blocking. And so putting, you know, a certain type of tasks into a certain period, you know, administrative. For me, it was housekeeping this morning, you know, and so, yeah, for me, jumping between completely unrelated types of tasks isn't good, but, you know, that can be a great strategy for energy matching and kind of, you know, are you in a creative headspace, or are you, you know, in kind of a more rote, you know, routine space, and using that as a way sort of focus versus, you know, can be another way of managing multitasking.
Another question I want to ask, and for those listening, I was poking around ahead of time, coming up with questions for Amy based on what seemed to be typical traits and things that people with ADHD were having trouble with. And one of the symptoms, I don't think you actually mentioned this when you were sharing some traits, but that I came across as kind of low frustration tolerance,
Oh
which is
yeah.
funny because I'm all about that too. I talked about, like we've talked about in another shows, how like autism can have a lot of the similar kinds of traits. So I actually have found it comforting just to know that is a really typical problem. It's like not just like, dude, what's wrong with me? Why am I so mad at this little thing on this particular day? Do you want to talk about that at all? And if you have any
Sure.
tips for maybe dealing with that when you're feeling that way?
Well, knowing that you're not alone is kind of one of them. And again, part of it is the ADHD brain doesn't necessarily have as easily accessible sort of a pause and evaluate mechanism as other people, or as neurotypical. But low frustration tolerance is not uncommon, and a lot of it can have to do with how good is your, overall self-care, and what's going on in your life, in your world. But yeah, it can manifest as kind of an irrational annoyance at, somebody cutting you off. One time I remember I got absolutely livid at the jam falling off a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And I'm like, what the hell is wrong with me? I'm still not really sure why, but it can surface in some really bizarre places. And at the time I had no idea that I had ADHD, but it was, again, just something I chalked up to like a weird character day. But frustration tolerance, especially when you start noticing it, the best thing, and it's easier said than done sometimes, is to step back and take a breath and really practice the art of the pause. Pausing before you go out the door in the morning, pausing before you leave your desk at the end of the day, and giving your brain a few seconds to try and catch up.
That's interesting, because I know a lot of times it'll just be like how well, you mentioned healthcare or body care, self-care, how well I slept the night before. I've noticed like if I get kind of having a couple of bad days, like for some reason in the morning, like I'm super pissed because the dog wrapped his leash around the tree. I mean, he does that. He's gonna go pee on the tree. He does it all the time. And some days you're just like laugh it off and like, come on, dude. But other days you're like, dude, what is wrong with you? Why can you not get this leash thing? It's so stupid. You're standing there having this angry conversation. Fortunately, pets are very forgiving. But
Yeah,
is
well,
there
and I
anything
think,
with this pause that's just anything else? Are you breathing, or is there, I don't know.
well, breathing can do a lot. Sort of the, breathe in through your nose for 4, hold for 2, and out for 3, I think is the pattern somebody taught me. Another really interesting grounding technique that somebody taught me was 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, which is you're looking for 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can smell, 2 things you can hear, and 1 thing you can taste. Doesn't matter actually what sense you necessarily tie each of the numbers to, but it really drops you back into your body and hopefully gets you out of that fight or flight stage that your body sort of dropped into. And so it's kind of how do you come back to yourself, and practice, is really, and some understanding and, willingness to apologize. Like you said, your dogs are forgiving, but if you were to take that out on your significant other repeatedly, this probably is going to create some more challenging dynamics, and that's a whole nother challenge.
That's a good point, that when that happens, you are in this state of like the fight or flight. And I know a lot of the breathing exercises, it's funny because we always advise people take big, deep breaths, but actually most of the breathing exercises are designed to like lower the level of oxygen you're getting into your body. And that tends to put you into a parasympathetic state, which I thought was fascinating because I didn't know that. It's sort of it's the opposite of take deep breaths will actually put more oxygen, and like that's fuel for the fire. So I don't know. That's just an interesting
Yeah,
tidbit
I
I
was going to
learned.
say I'm not necessarily as well versed in all of the sympathetic versus parasympathetic, and or my short-term memory. It's like right now it's like I've read a lot of it, and which one goes with which direction is
I
really
know,
interesting
that's
and
true.
not
Now I'm like, did I get
mentally
the right
pure
word?
this morning. Yeah,
Parasympathetic nervous system. The rest and digest,
yeah.
conserving energy, slowing the heart rate, that kind of thing. as we look it up on the fly to
Well,
make sure we're
yeah, well, I
right.
was going to say, one, the deep breathing, I think, is really more about calming that parasympathetic nervous system. You know, it's not hyperventilating deep breathing, it's
Right. Well,
slow,
it's
deep breathing.
actually most of the exercises are like you take a breath and then you're pausing for a few seconds, and then like the exhale tends to be even slower. And
Yeah,
so that's how it's working. Not just like breathe into a bag they used to suggest, but
yeah,
anyway, we kind of
yes, yeah.
wandered off there. Just a couple more questions for you here today. You mentioned kind of people can struggle with forgetting meetings or appointments. Do you have
Oh,
any
yeah.
tools or tips for doing less of
Well,
that?
how many commitments are you really making? Because the cognitive load of changing and hitting all of those meetings and commitments is energy intensive. Making sure that you're using a calendar, you know, especially a digital or electronic one, with reminders set so that you're, a lot of ADHD people are also what we call time blind, or just less aware of time in the moment. And so having something outside of you that's going to trigger that awareness of, okay, I need to switch gears. And so having it, you know, the reminder go off before the meeting so that you can transition into the meeting. Another thing I've been trying to get better about again is allowing time and space between meetings and not just back to back to back, because of A, travel time, B, mentally changing gears, C, the meeting runs long, D, I need to go grab a glass of water. And also, so it's just I've come into a meeting less hyped up. Another thing that I have gotten better at over the years is remembering that I need to schedule travel time for a meeting, especially if I'm going somewhere. And that just because I made it there one time in 20 minutes does not mean I'm going to make it there in 20 minutes with Seattle traffic all the time. So I still don't always allow myself enough extra time. What else have I done?
It is a good point about traffic and stuff, like, because that if you're late, like the instant you realize I'm on schedule to be late, it's like creating all this stress, and you kind of arrive in that fight or flight, you know, but easier said than done. Just leave early, or, you know, but I don't know. My mom was always like, somebody was always on time, and she'd just get there super early and read, which is probably
Yeah.
great if you can do
Oh,
it.
see, that drove me nuts when my mom would do that. I'm like, you know, I don't want to sit there and wait, and I'm wasting my time, is kind of how I always felt. And so there's somewhere in between that. The other one that I was trying to think of is, you know, trying to remember that, you know, paying attention to what, you know, a 10 o'clock start. What does that mean to you? Does that mean walking into the building? Does that mean parking? It took me a lot of years to realize that if I'm supposed to be somewhere at 10, that in my head mentally, that was equivalent to driving into the parking lot at 10, not, you know, giving myself an extra 3 or 4 minutes to park and then walk into the building. But that was a hard realization to come to, that, you know, if I'm planning for a 10 o'clock arrival, I really need to make it more like 9:55 according to my GPS, because I don't teleport. As much as I might like to, I don't teleport.
Is it at all useful to kind of trick yourself by like putting in your calendar, the meeting starts at 9:50?
Yeah, I've done that, and that can be helpful. But then there have been times I've also, you know, set a medical appointment for, you know, 20 or 30 minutes early in my calendar and forgot I did that, and then added another 20 minutes. So I've shown up like 45 minutes early for something. But yeah, that can be a great strategy.
Take your book, take your podcast and listen in the car. I don't know. I guess it just depends on you. Like my mom loves reading, so she was always super cool with that type of strategy. But yeah, I think I tend towards being rushed, and not because I want to be, but just seems to be that way. All right, a last question since you've mentioned household chores and stuff, and I think that's probably something a lot of people struggle with. And maybe when you live alone, it's less of a thing. Although, like, I find that if I have people coming over, it's a really good incentive to like make it tidier than I would necessarily worry about on my own. Do you have
Yeah.
any tips for getting stuff done like that?
Mm, really, a lot of times understanding the 5 primary motivators for ADHD might give you a way to sort of flip your motivation around something, by looking at ways to make it novel, creating some sort of competition. I think if you were dealing with ADHD, having people coming over sort of creates a sense of urgency to get something done, interest or, desire to do it, or, play or humor can be another way. So, you know, ADHD, there's kind of this lack of, just get it done button in your head. So you have to find some other ways. So making a game, setting a timer, finding a way to, I'm going to spend 10 minutes cleaning and then I'm, going to go sit on the porch and read, something positive at the end of it. A lot of it really depends on the person.
Do you find it, I think one thing that's actually when I get a lot of stuff done is I'm a big YouTube listener to podcasts and stuff or on audiobooks also. If something happens to be really keeping my attention and really good, I actually want to like do the dishes and stuff that I have to use my hands for, but I can sit there and listen to it because otherwise I can't listen to that stuff while I'm working. But while I'm doing laundry or something, I totally can listen to a podcast. So I don't know if that if that works for other people or not.
I think it might, and I think it may depend on the person. One time, a client and knew that she always felt better when she exercised, but she just couldn't convince herself to do it. So she started watching her favorite TV program while walking on the treadmill or, doing stuff at the gym, obviously not weights, because weights and watching videos on your phone are probably not totally compatible. But tying two tasks together, something you're not as interested in with something that is actually pleasurable is a great way to do it. And a lot of times too, we didn't even sort of hit on executive function, and that might be another topic for another day. But where was I going with that? My own executive functions are challenging me at the moment, but sometimes the initiating can be the hardest part for some people. And so once you get started, like you said, you want to keep doing it, because you've gotten over that first hump or that first hurdle. And so sometimes if you can just get started, the ability to finish is much easier. Not always.
No, I found that true with writing too. Sometimes it's super hard to like get into it, but usually I find that once you get into it, you can do more than like sometimes you just have to tell yourself, if I just do like 500 words, that's totally cool. And maybe you end up doing like 2,000.
Yeah. It's, I can hear that we use some similar strategies, that are fall under that, probably they work for most people, but, are especially useful for, people who are what the term I kind of like, the circulating as neurodivergent or sort of, off that normal for whatever reason. Not that we all don't have our own reasons that we're, well, normal. What is normal? And philosophically thinking aside, that's an entire lifetime's worth of thinking right there.
That's a better term. It sounds cooler to be neurodivergent than special. Interesting.
Yeah, quirky.
Yeah, I got that one. So that was the last question I had for you today. Do you want to let people know where they can find you if they want to see more of your videos or you
Yeah,
do coaching
so
and stuff?
I've got a YouTube channel that's under Creative Catapult Coaching, which is, I assume, where a lot of folks are finding this. My website is creativecatapultcoach.com. You can shoot me an email at amy@creativecatapultcoach.com. And I'm really interested to hear about people's experiences and, what's working for them and what, where your biggest hangups are. I guess you can also find me on Facebook being more amused by coffee memes that I've created lately, as well as some short philosophical reflections that I'm having a fun time thinking about and sharing my thoughts.
Awesome. Well, thanks for listening, and thank you for being with us, Amy, with me, I guess. And guys, if you found this helpful, subscribe to Amy's channel, Creative Catapult Coaching. Give it a thumbs up. That will encourage Amy, because I had to kind of talk her into
Yep.
I think all like entrepreneurs that or people doing anything, that the marketing is the hard part, like being out there and like being found. So we appreciate you listening.
Yep. Well, and just again, a reminder that, we like to, in a culture that really values individuality, really knowing that you're not alone and figuring out how to work with people and be in community with others. And just know that you're not the only one going through, pretty much anything. There's 8.5 billion people out there right now. You're probably not the only one dealing with whatever variation of your challenges.
Very good reminder. And thank you, everyone. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye. Damn it. Cancel.
The awkward dismount.
Yep.
We're